In addition to those two aspects of the transaction, the securities and the securities side and the purchase side, there will also be a tax side. So lender A will also pay at the time of that sale Lender A will pay at the time of that sale a pigovian tax to the domestic government. But then you may be asking yourself, well then, so what? It pays the tax, but it's still gonna try to sell it to another party. Well, but that party's a subsequent party will still take on that external cost. So how is it being paid for that external cost? It's great that the internal parties are paying for that external cost, but how does the party that ends up taking on that external cost, how does it pay for that external cost? Well, that's where the other side of this pigovian tax comes in. So what happens on that side is the domestic government
pays the pigovian tax revenue to the party that ends up being the buyer of the loans. Okay, so look at it this way.
Lender A So again, lender A will issue 100 loan securities to party 1 in exchange for party 1 purchasing those 100 loans from lender A. Lender A at the time of that sale will also pay the pigovian tax to the domestic government, and then the domestic government will transfer the pigovian tax revenue from that tax transaction. They will transfer that revenue raised from that tax transaction to party 1. So in the process, two steps happen in that process. Number one, in lender A paying the pigovian tax, they take on the external costs they otherwise would not take through the normal market without an intervention. And they also, it's number two, in the process of the domestic government transferring the pigovian tax revenue from that tax transaction to party 1. In that process, party 1 ends up getting paid for that external cost. Okay, that they're taking on at that time that they're not getting paid for by lender A, and otherwise in the normal market. Okay, so in the process, the externality is resolved. It's resolved again twofold. The internal parties end up taking on the external costs, and also the external parties end up being paid for that external cost. Now you may be asking yourself, okay, well that's great, but what about party 1? I mean, lender A tried to externalize the risk and liquidity costs of the loan by selling it to party 1. Well, isn't party 1 going to do the same thing when they try to sell it to party 2? Exactly. So what that means is the government has to charge this for each time the loan is sold. And then so all the way down, each time another party buys the loan,
the party selling it has to pay the pigovian tax, and the party buying it receives the pigovian tax revenue from that's generated from that same tax transaction from the party paying that tax in that transaction in the first place. Okay? So it looks like this.
So the situation ends up looking something like this. Okay. Oh, I forgot the tax part. So our situation ends up looking something like this. Okay. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what should this pigovian tax be equal to on each transaction? Well, it's something equating RP plus LP, the risk premium plus the liquidity premium. Okay. Now you may be asking yourself, well, how is the government supposed to do that? I would answer, well, the same way that lenders do it when they choose to charge RP and LP, which they normally do, again, if they are going to hold the loan for the full term of repayment loan and not sell it to someone else in that meantime. So, and you may ask yourself, well, how do lenders figure that out? Well, they oftentimes figure out the RP and LP, particularly by looking at someone's credit history and based on that figuring out their credit risk. So then the worse the history, higher RP and LP will probably be. And also the better the credit profile, the better the credit risk then usually, and also typically the lower RP and LP is. And what oftentimes in this modern age, what lenders use is they use computers and computer programs to quickly pull up someone's credit history, and not only quickly pull it up, but also quickly run some calculations through it to figure out some quick computerized measures such as credit scores and other types of credit assessments. And so then that allows them to, for example, make a 30-second decision. Meaning, 30 seconds after someone applies, for example, for a credit card, the lender can then decide whether to issue that credit card or not, and also if they choose to issue it, at what interest rate. Whether it's a low-risk interest rate, such as 10% maybe, or a higher risk interest rate. Okay, so The government can do the same thing. They can use similar computers and computer programs to figure out an appropriate, based on that person's credit, based on the borrower's credit in that transaction, the appropriate RP and LP that should be charged. And then that can be how they would determine the appropriate pigovian tax to charge for each transaction. And because it would be determined differently for each transaction, it would be appropriate for each transaction, so it wouldn't be too much for some and too little for others. And so the pigovian tax would be different for each transaction and would hopefully be appropriate for each transaction. Okay. And in using, and so what would happen is, with this pigovian tax, what that means is all the internal parties would take on this external risk and liquidity costs, and also the party that ends up, the final party that holds the loan, that ends up taking on this risk and liquidity costs, they will get paid for that external cost. Okay? And through those two methods, through the internal parties taking on the external cost and through the external party being paid for that external cost, through those two methods, our negative cost externality in this situation is resolved. Add to the supply curve private cost to lender A, and it would bring it up from here to here. Now, a couple of things. In doing that, it would bring out a new equilibrium. Let's say in this instance, our new quantity equilibrium is 80. And let's say our new price equilibrium is 6% per year. Now you may be saying, well, wait a minute. Doesn't that mean then that there will be less borrowers, so 80 instead of 100, and won't that mean the interest rate will be higher, 6% instead of 4%? Yes. Those are two implications of this pigovian tax. But if you think about it, one of the things that led up to the Great Recession of 2008 is you had too many borrowers, and many of them were getting loans at way too low rates of interest. Some of the interest rates were even below market rates, especially if it was a mortgage, if it was a residential mortgage where the loan would start out low and then it would get higher later on, which is called an adjustable rate mortgage or an ARM. So, if this happens, yes, one negative side effect is you will have less borrowers, but that's one way you correct this externality problem. And you will also have another negative side effect is you'll have higher interest rates, but again, that's another thing that needs to happen for this externality problem to be resolved. Okay? Now, and the other thing too is because the internal parties, so party 2, party 1, and lender A, and especially lender A, because they are taking on these external problems through the pigovian tax, then that's one of the reasons why they're going to lend out to less borrowers and lend at higher rates of interest is they are taking on that external cost, specifically the external cost of risk and liquidity. Therefore, they are going to be more careful with, number one, how many people they issue them to and who they issue them to, what kind of credit risk people they issue them, risk level people they issue them to. And also, they will be more careful at charging a rate of interest that's higher and that's more that's more reasonable as opposed to an interest rate that's much too low and much too it's too extreme in the low range. Okay. Now, as I said, one of the other important parts and components to a case study is the critical aspect. Okay. So let's look at those problems. First of all, we got to look at the problem. Well, wait a minute. So in this example, the government has to collect the pigovian tax when it's paid, and then transfer the pigovian tax. So the domestic government has to collect the pigovian tax when each seller of the loan sells the loan, and they also have to transfer the pigovian tax revenue from that tax to each buyer of the loans, in those same transactions.